So we know what the internet is. We know where it is. The next question is, how are my files actually stored on the internet? How are my files accessed? My PDF files, my images, my snaps, my TikTok videos, my Instagram pictures. How are they stored and how do I access it? Even my website, when I go to dig.ng, it's actually, it could potentially be a file or a generated code. So how are these accessed? So let's look at a quick demonstration here. We have the internet, a broader concept here. And then within the internet, we have different cloud providers. So let's say we have AWS here, we have Google, we have Microsoft Cloud. So this is their servers. Now there are a lot of other cloud providers that exist, not just this. Google is GCP, AWS is Amazon is AWS, Microsoft is Azure, Facebook also has theirs. A lot of companies actually have the cloud provider here. So within the internet, we have different cloud providers. We're just focusing on this AWS, Google, and Microsoft for this one. And don't forget, servers are just computers that are modified to host files that are going to be available on the public internet. So what happens is, when I upload my video to TikTok, for example, from my phone, when I upload a video, this video or this PDF or whatever, or my profile image, these videos get stored on the server. So if the backend or the application I'm currently interacting with, maybe TikTok or your company's application, if it's currently hosted on AWS servers, or even if it's a local server, right? So but let's assume it's hosted on AWS server. So if it's hosted on AWS server, these files are stored on the server the same way you would have a file stored on your local computer. So you can just go to directory and actually search for it. So it's actually not complex at all. The way you have a file stored on your local computer is the way your images, your PDFs are actually stored on these remote servers. Right. So when I want to access it, I cannot make a request and say, oh, I need this file. And the server itself or the backend application has a way of not processing it. We are going to learn more about this in consequent modules. This is just an introduction. But the server itself or the backend application now goes to the server and has a way of now processing and identifying that, oh, this is the location of this on the disk, on the hard drive, and returns the image or the PDF to you. So that's just it, right? The way the PDFs, your images are stored on the local computer is very similar to the way these files are stored on a remote server. Now, that's the way it was actually for a long time before the concept of databases. And we'll talk about databases. There's a dedicated model for databases. We'll talk about databases. But you want to store things like files, PDFs, images on the file in the file system. But then how do you store things like my account balance? How do you store my name, my emails? Because these are not files. These are data types. Don't forget, in future modules, we'll talk about data types also. We'll talk about databases. So if you don't understand it deeply now, it's fine. But how do you store names? How do you store my age? These are not files, right? These are complex. These are data types. These are abstract data types, right? How do you store it? So in the past, what would have had was when I make a request from the front-end application. So this is the front-end application. When I make a request from the front-end application to add my age, to update my record with my age, maybe using the REST API, which we will talk about later. When I make a request, it opens up a file on the backend. Don't forget, when I upload a file, a picture, you can just store the file as a file on the backend. But now to store my age or my email address or my name, which are abstract data, they're not really files, right? Or my account balance. So it opens up a file. It keeps a file for me, Demilade. So maybe on the particular directory, user/account/Demilade. It keeps a file for me and it opens up the file. It writes my age to the file and then it closes the file and it returns a response that, oh, this has been stored. So the next time I go to the application to fetch for my age or to fetch for my profile information, you can just make a request, open the file, read the content of the file, and get the response. So it's still basically stored in the file format, or at least that's how it used to be. So basically what I'm saying now is that almost everything is stored as files in remote servers. They are not stored in a more complex format. They are stored as files in the remote servers. That's how all our data, most of our data actually stored. Now, there is something called a database, which we'll talk more about later. But this allows us to create a much more interesting layer on top of the files that we are storing. So there's something called database, which allows us to abstract the file system, because we can't be opening up a file every time someone wants to update their database, or someone wants to update their profile picture or their name. We can't be opening up a file and closing it. It's not very efficient, it's time consuming, it's CPU consuming. So we invented something called a database within the server. So we have database, and behind the scene, a database actually still stores it as a file behind the scene in a much more structured, interesting format with indexes and some complex data structure that makes it easy to work. We are not going to go too deep into that one yet, but behind the scenes, it's not as a file. But with database, I can just update a record, a data structure record, which we'll talk about more in the data structure part. I can just update it and store this is my age, my location on, say, for example, my SQL table. That's the form of record, right? So I can just send in my SQL table. I have a row and a column, and the row I say, okay, this is the age, and the column I say this is name like this age, or name like this email, or name like this name. So we would go deeply into this, but there are two ways my information can be stored on the server. One is as a file, the other is as a database, which so leverages the file system behind the hood, just an abstraction over it at the end of the day. One final thing I'm going to say before we go to the next part is, for regular things like images, PDF, you want to store it as a regular file. But for abstract data types like strings, integers, names, emails, you want to store it in the database. It's easier to retrieve, it's easier to write. Now you can, for some reason, you can actually store PDFs, files in the database, but most of the time you advise against it. What you do instead is you store this as a file, then you store in the database the location to the file. Don't worry if it still seems very complex. When we go deeper into each of these units, when we talk about data structures, when we talk about databases, when we talk about REST APIs, you're going to understand it more in depth. But just know that at the back of the mind, records are stored in the servers, in my backend, as files and as databases. And if I want to store a PDF, I'm most likely going to be storing it as a file, as a regular file, and now getting the URL of that PDF and storing it in my database. If I'm going to be storing more abstract data like my account balance, my name, my email, I'm going to be storing it directly in the database. Yeah, so that's it. In the next one, I'll just be explaining how my front-end application, my phone, my device, my laptop knows which of the servers to connect to. Does it connect to AWS server? Does it connect to GCP server? Once I turn on my internet, how does it know which server in particular to connect to make a request for this service? Like I said earlier, these are just an introduction. Over time, you understand it better. This is just to introduce the concept of internet to you as a whole. So see you in the next topic.